November 23, 1944. The Philippine island of Leyte. Corporal James Mitchell crouched behind a fallen coconut palm, watching through his field glasses as the Japanese tank rumbled into the clearing. The Type 97 Chiha medium tank, Japan's most advanced armoured vehicle in widespread service, advanced with what seemed like confidence. Its turret traversed slowly, searching for targets among the marine positions dug into the muddy hillside. Mitchell had seen plenty of Japanese tanks by now. The light Type 95 Hargos that fell apart under 50 caliber machine gun fire. But this was different. This was supposed to be Japan's answer to American armor. Intelligence briefings had warned them about the Chiha, bigger than the Hargo, better armed with a 57mm gun, more armor. The tank that Japanese commanders believed could challenge American Shermans. What happened in the next 7 minutes would shatter that belief completely. The story of how Japanese tankers discovered their best tank was obsolete begins not with defeat, but with pride earned through years of success against weaker opponents. The Type 97 Chiha was no accident of desperation. It was the product of careful military planning that began in 1935, when the Japanese Imperial Army recognized that their Type 89 medium tank had become inadequate for modern mechanized warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Type 89, Japan's primary medium tank since 1929, had served well in Manchuria and China. It mounted a short-barreled 57mm gun and could support infantry at walking pace. But by the mid-1930s, military observers watching conflicts in Spain and skirmishes between Soviet and Japanese forces recognized that armor doctrine was evolving rapidly. Tanks needed to be faster, more mobile, and capable of engaging enemy armor at longer ranges. The Army Technical Bureau issued specifications in 1935 for a new medium tank. It would weigh approximately 15 tons, substantially heavier than the light Type 95 Hargo. It would mount a 57mm gun with improved velocity and penetration compared to the Type 89. It would achieve speeds of 40 km per hour on roads. And critically, it would have armor sufficient to resist anti-tank rifle fire and light anti-tank guns that were becoming increasingly common on modern battlefields. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries received the contract. The same company that had designed the Type 95 Hargo now faced the challenge of creating Japan's next-generation medium tank. The design team, led by engineer Tomio Hara, worked with clear parameters. The tank needed to be producible with Japan's limited industrial capacity. It needed to be maintainable in the field, with minimal specialized equipment, and it needed to outmatch anything the Chinese could field while being adequate against Soviet armor. By 1937, Mitsubishi completed the first prototypes. The Imperial Army conducted extensive trials at proving grounds in Manchuria and Japan proper. The prototype impressed military observers with several key features. It was mechanically reliable, using a Mitsubishi Type 97 12-cylinder air-cooled diesel engine that produced 170 horsepower at 2,000 revolutions per minute. Diesel fuel was more readily available across Japan's expanding empire than gasoline, particularly in Manchuria and Southeast Asia, where petroleum supplies were limited. The engine could run for approximately 8 hours on its internal fuel capacity of 110 litres, giving the tank an operational range of approximately 210 kilometres on roads. Cross-country range was naturally lower, perhaps 130 kilometres depending on terrain. The suspension system used a bell crank design similar to the Type 95 Hargo, proven effective in the earlier light tank. It provided adequate shock absorption for the heavier vehicle, though the ride remained rough by Western standards. The tank measured 5.5 meters long, 2.33 meters wide, and 2.38 meters tall. In American measurements, that was 18 feet long, 7 feet 8 inches wide, and 7 feet 10 inches tall. Significantly larger than the Hargo light tank, though still compact compared to Soviet or American medium tanks, The weight came in at 15.0 tons for the basic tank, reaching approximately 15.8 tons when loaded with crew, fuel, ammunition, and supplies. The armour represented a significant improvement over the Ha-Go. The front hull plate was 25 mm thick. The turret front was also 25 mm. Side armour was 25 mm on the hull and turret. Rear armour was 20 mm. Roof and belly plates were approximately 10 to 12 mm. Japanese designers calculated this would be sufficient to resist anti-tank rifle fire at combat ranges and provide protection against shell fragments from high-explosive rounds bursting nearby. Inside, the tank was cramped but more spacious than the Ha-Go. The crew consisted of 4 men. The driver sat in the front left of the hull with limited vision through a small armoured periscope and vision port. A hull machine gunner sat to the driver's right, operating a Type 97 7.7mm machine gun mounted in a ball mount in the hull front plate. The commander occupied the turret along with the gunner, a significant improvement over the Ha-Go where the commander worked alone. The commander stood in the turret left side, directing the driver through a speaking tube, coordinating with other tanks when radio equipment was available, and operating a second 7.7mm machine gun, mounted in the turret rear. The gunner sat in the turret right side, operating the main armament and traversing the turret by hand crank. The main gun was the Type 97 57mm tank gun, a longer-barreled weapon than the howitzer-style gun mounted in the Type 89. This gun could fire both high-explosive and armour-piercing rounds. The armour-piercing round weighed approximately 2.6 kilograms and left the barrel at approximately 400 meters per second muzzle velocity. Japanese testing indicated this round could penetrate approximately 30 millimeters of vertical armor plate at 500 meters range. This was adequate performance against Soviet BT series tanks, which had armor thickness of 13 to 22 millimeters on the hull front depending on model and angle. The Type 97 was formally adopted by the Imperial Army in 1937. The designation came from the Japanese imperial calendar, marking the 2597th year since the legendary founding of Japan. As with other Japanese military equipment, only the last 2 digits were used in the type number. Production began at Mitsubishi facilities in 1938, with additional production later assigned to other manufacturers as demand increased. The timing was fortunate for Japanese forces. The Chiha entered service just as the war in China intensified following the Marco Polo Bridge incident in July 1937. Japanese armoured units needed modern equipment for the vast campaigns across China's interior. The Type 97 Chiha proved itself admirably in this environment. Against Chinese forces that possessed virtually no armour and extremely limited anti-tank weapons, the Chiha was devastatingly effective. Its 57mm gun could destroy fortifications and suppress infantry positions. Its machine guns provided effective anti-personnel fire. Its mobility, though not exceptional by Western standards, was more than adequate for pursuing retreating Chinese forces across varied terrain. Japanese tank crews gained extensive combat experience and growing confidence in their equipment. In battle after battle through 1938 and 1939, Chiha tanks supported infantry operations with few losses. The Chinese simply had no effective counter. Anti-tank rifles were rare. Anti-tank guns were almost non-existent. Artillery was mostly used for indirect fire against area targets rather than direct fire against armour. The Chiha crews could operate with relative impunity, learning their trade in an environment where their tanks were clearly superior to anything they might encounter. This success bred a dangerous assumption. Japanese tankers and commanders began to believe the Chiha was a genuinely capable medium tank rather than a vehicle optimized for colonial warfare against poorly equipped opponents. The assumption was tested somewhat at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, where Japanese and Soviet forces clashed along the Mongolian border. Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks, though lightly armoured, mounted 45mm guns with better armour penetration than the Japanese 57mm gun due to higher muzzle velocity. Soviet doctrine emphasized speed and firepower. Their tanks could achieve remarkable speeds on roads, up to 70 kilometers per hour for the BT-7. In direct engagements, Chi-Ha tanks found themselves in difficult situations. The Soviet 45mm gun could penetrate the Chi-Ha's 25mm frontal armor at ranges beyond 1,000 meters. The Japanese 57mm gun struggled to penetrate the BT series tank's frontal armor at similar ranges due to lower muzzle velocity and less sophisticated armor-piercing ammunition. Japanese tactics compensated somewhat. Aggressive maneuvers, use of terrain, and superior training allowed Japanese tank crews to achieve some success. But the battles revealed uncomfortable truths. The Chi-Ha was vulnerable to dedicated anti-tank weapons. Its armor, while adequate against small arms and shell fragments, could be defeated by purpose-built anti-tank guns. Its main gun, effective against fortifications and infantry, was marginal at best against enemy armor. By the end of the Khalkhin-Gol campaign in September 1939, Japan had lost significant numbers of tanks, including many Chi-Has. Military leadership recognized the lessons but failed to act decisively. Rather than initiating a complete redesign of Japanese armor doctrine and equipment, they focused on tactical improvements and crew training. The war in China continued, and there the Chi-Ha remained dominant. Officers and tankers continued to gain confidence in equipment that was only adequate against second-rate opposition. When the Pacific War began in December 1941, Japanese armor achieved remarkable initial successes. In Malaya, Japanese tank units, including Chi-Ha mediums, supported the rapid advance down the peninsula toward Singapore. British forces, who had not deployed significant armor to Malaya, believing the terrain unsuitable, were unprepared for Japanese mobile warfare. The combination of light Ha-Go tanks for reconnaissance and Chi-Ha mediums for breakthrough operations proved devastatingly effective. In the Philippines, Japanese armor landed with invasion forces and supported infantry operations across Luzon. On December 22, 1941, north of Damortis, Japanese tanks engaged American M3 Stuart light tanks. Both sides mounted 37mm guns on their light tanks, though the American gun had superior ballistic performance. The Chi-Ha mediums, with their 57mm guns, had a theoretical advantage in these engagements. At close range, in jungle and plantation fighting, Japanese tankers achieved some success. The battles were confused, chaotic affairs where surprise and aggressive tactics often mattered more than technical specifications. Japanese tank crews trusted their machines and their training. They had defeated every opponent they had faced. When orders came to defend the Philippines in 1944, they brought their Chi-Ha tanks without questioning their adequacy against American armor. But 1944 was not 1941. The Americans returning to the Philippines were not the under-equipped, under-trained force that had been driven from the islands 3 years earlier. They brought overwhelming material superiority and hard-won combat experience, and most critically, they brought Sherman tanks in numbers Japanese planners had not imagined possible. The M4 Sherman medium tank represented American industrial might and a fundamentally different design philosophy from Japanese armor. Where the Chi-Ha weighed 15 tons, the Sherman M4A3 variant common in the Pacific weighed 32 tons. Where the Chi-Ha mounted 25 millimeters of frontal armor, the Sherman had 51 millimeters on the hull front, angled at 56 degrees to provide effective protection equivalent to approximately 75 millimeters against anti-tank projectiles. The Sherman's main armament was a 75 millimeter gun with a muzzle velocity of approximately 620 meters per second, using standard armor-piercing ammunition. This gave it penetration capability far exceeding the Japanese 57 millimeter gun. The Sherman could penetrate the Chi-Ha's armor from over 1,500 meters away. The Chi-Ha could only hope to damage a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges under 300 meters, and even then success was far from guaranteed. American tankers knew about Japanese armor from earlier campaigns. They had faced Ha-Go light tanks at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and numerous other islands. They knew Japanese tanks were thinly armored and vulnerable, but intelligence briefings about the Chiha suggested it might pose a more serious threat. It was bigger, it had more armor, it mounted a larger gun. Some American crews wondered if they might finally face a real tank battle in the Pacific, something approaching the armored engagements their counterparts in Europe dealt with regularly. The battle that would answer this question began on November 23, 1944, as American forces advanced inland from the Leyte beachhead. The 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, pushed toward Japanese positions near the town of Karigara. Intelligence reports indicated Japanese armor in the area, likely elements of the 2nd Tank Division that had been stationed in the Philippines since early 1944. Marine infantry moved cautiously through coconut plantations and rice paddies. The terrain was difficult, muddy from recent rains, cut by numerous drainage ditches and small streams. Visibility was limited by vegetation. It was ideal ambush country. Sherman tanks. From the 1st Tank Battalion moved in support, their powerful engines audible across the landscape. The tankers maintained careful spacing, avoiding bunching up that would make them vulnerable to artillery or coordinated anti-tank ambush. At approximately 1000 hours, the point squad reported movement ahead, dark shapes emerging from a tree line, the distinctive sound of diesel engines, Japanese armor. Corporal Mitchell, positioned with his rifle squad in a defensive line, raised his field glasses. He counted 6 tanks initially. All appeared to be Chiha mediums, identified by their distinctive turret shape and longer gun barrels compared to the Hargo lights. The Japanese tanks advanced in a rough formation, moving across an open field toward the Marine positions. It appeared to be a deliberate counterattack, coordinated with infantry that Mitchell could see moving in the tree line behind the armor. This was exactly the kind of combined arms operation Japanese forces had executed so successfully in 1941 and 1942. But circumstances had changed dramatically. Lieutenant Harrison, commanding the lead Sherman platoon, observed the Japanese tanks through his commander's cupola. He calmly issued orders over the radio net. All tanks were to hold fire until the Japanese closed to approximately 800 meters. He wanted clean shots with minimal chance of missing. His gunner, Sergeant Robert Chen, tracked the lead Japanese tank through his telescopic sight. The range was decreasing steadily as the Chihas advanced. 1,000 meters, 900 meters, 850 meters. At 800 meters, Lieutenant Harrison gave the fire command. Sergeant Chen squeezed the trigger. The Sherman's 75mm gun fired with a tremendous crack. The recoil mechanism absorbed the gun's recoil smoothly. Chen was already traversing slightly to track the target. The armor-piercing round crossed the 800 meters in approximately 1.3 seconds. It struck the lead Chiha on the frontal glacis plate, slightly left of center. The Japanese tank's 25mm armor, sloped at only about 10 to 15 degrees from vertical, offered minimal resistance. The 75mm round, traveling at over 600 meters per second with tremendous kinetic energy, punched through the plate as if it were sheet metal. The round continued through the fighting compartment, struck the engine block, and detonated the diesel fuel. The Chiha exploded from within. Fire erupted from every opening, the hatches, vision ports, and turret ring. The turret lifted slightly from the explosion pressure, then settled back askew. One crew member attempted to bail out through the hull machine gunner's hatch. He emerged halfway, on fire, and collapsed. The other Shermans opened fire. The sound was overwhelming. The crack of multiple 75mm guns firing in rapid succession. The scream of armor-piercing shot crossing the battlefield. The explosion of tanks being hit and penetrated. In less than 1 minute, 4 of the 6 Japanese tanks were burning wrecks. The remaining 2 attempted to turn and retreat, exposing their thinner side armor. Both were hit within seconds. One continued moving for perhaps 20 meters, trailing smoke, before the engine seized. The crew bailed out through the rear hull door, running for the tree line under small arms fire from Marine infantry. The other tank stopped immediately when hit. Its crew abandoned the vehicle and scattered. Some made it to cover. Others were cut down by machine gun fire from the Shermans and Marine positions. The entire engagement lasted approximately 3 minutes from first shot to last. 6 Japanese Chi-Ha medium tanks destroyed, 0 American tanks damaged. It was not a battle. It was a demonstration of overwhelming technological superiority. Corporal Mitchell watched the burning tanks with a mixture of satisfaction and something approaching pity. He had expected more. Intelligence briefings had suggested the Chi-Ha might actually pose a threat, but the reality was the same as facing Hargo light tanks. Japanese armor simply could not compete. After the area was secured, Marine officers and tankers walked among the destroyed Chi-Has, examining them closely. What they found confirmed what the battle had demonstrated. The tanks were obsolete, hopelessly outmatched against American armor. The first thing that struck every observer was how thin the armor was. Lieutenant Harrison ran his hand over a penetration hole in one tank's frontal plate. The armor was barely 1 inch thick, 25 millimeters. The Sherman's frontal armor was twice that thickness and mounted at a better angle. A 75 millimeter armor-piercing round had gone completely through this tank, front to back, exiting through the rear plate and continuing on into the mud beyond. Inside the destroyed tanks, crews had clearly suffered catastrophic casualties. The Chi-Ha's interior layout offered no protection against penetrating hits. Ammunition racks stored loosely throughout the fighting compartment meant that any penetration had a high probability of detonating stored rounds. Several tanks showed evidence of secondary explosions that had blown them apart from inside. The turrets of 2 Chi-Has had been blown completely off their rings and lay several meters from the hull. The force required to do this indicated ammunition detonation, not just the initial penetrating hit. Marine tankers examined the Chi-Ha's 57 millimeter gun with professional interest. They measured the bore, examined the breech mechanism, and inspected ammunition found in the racks. The gun was well made, showing Japanese manufacturing quality, but it was fundamentally inadequate for tank versus tank combat in 1944. Sergeant Chen, who had fired the first shot in the engagement, did a quick calculation. The 57 millimeter gun's muzzle velocity was approximately 400 meters per second, based on the ammunition and gun specifications they could observe. The Sherman's 75 millimeter gun fired at 620 meters per second. That difference in velocity translated directly to penetration capability. The Japanese gun might penetrate 25 to 30 millimeters of vertical armor at 500 meters range. The Sherman's frontal armor was 51 millimeters thick and angled at 56 degrees from vertical, giving it effective thickness of approximately 75 millimeters against a projectile striking head-on. Simple mathematics revealed the problem. Even at point-blank range, even with a perfect 90-degree hit on the Sherman's flattest armor plate, the Chi-Ha's gun would struggle to penetrate. In reality, with the Sherman's armor angled and the likely combat engagement ranges of 300 to 800 meters, the Chi-Ha had virtually no chance of defeating American armor from the front. It could only hope to strike side or rear armor at close range, and even then penetration was not guaranteed. This was the shocking discovery that spread through Marine and Army tank units in the Philippines. Japanese medium tanks were not medium tanks by American or European standards. They were barely adequate light tanks facing genuine medium armor. The qualitative gap was so wide that engagements were essentially one-sided. An American Sherman could engage and destroy a Chi-Ha at ranges where the Japanese tank could not even hope to return effective fire. It was like watching a heavyweight boxer face a lightweight. The outcome was predetermined before the first punch was thrown. For Japanese tank crews throughout the Philippines, word of these engagements spread quickly. They knew what they faced. They had seen the Shermans. They understood their own equipment's limitations. But there was nothing they could do except continue fighting with what they had. Japan's industrial capacity could not produce better tanks in meaningful numbers, The tanks they had were the only tanks they would get. The Type 97 Chi-Ha, once Japan's pride and most advanced medium tank, had become a death trap for its crews. What Japanese military planners had failed to understand was that tank warfare had evolved dramatically between 1937, when the Chi-Ha was adopted, and 1944, when it faced American armor in the Philippines. In that 7-year span, armor thickness had increased, gun calibers had grown, muzzle velocities had improved, and fire control systems had become more sophisticated. The Chi-Ha's specifications, adequate in 1937, were hopelessly outdated by 1944. But the story of why the Chi-Ha failed against Shermans was not just about technical specifications. It was about design philosophy, industrial capacity, and strategic assumptions that proved fatally flawed. The Chi-Ha represented Japanese thinking about armor warfare. Japanese doctrine emphasized mobility and offensive firepower over protection. Tanks were supposed to support infantry, suppress enemy positions, and exploit breakthroughs. They were not primarily designed to fight other tanks. This doctrine made sense given Japan's likely opponents in the 1930s. Chinese forces had virtually no armor. Soviet tanks, while present in Manchuria, were not expected to be the primary threat in a Pacific conflict. Japanese planners assumed their armor would face infantry, fortifications, and light anti-tank weapons. The Chi-Ha was optimized for those missions. Against American Shermans, designed explicitly for tank versus tank combat in Europe, optimized to defeat German armor, the Chi-Ha never had a chance. The contrast in design priorities was stark. Japanese designers had minimized weight to improve mobility and reduce production costs. American designers had maximized protection and firepower, even at the cost of increased weight and complexity. Japanese tanks used simple, manually operated systems. American tanks employed power traverse, gyro stabilization, and sophisticated fire control. Japanese tanks had minimal crew comfort with cramped interiors and basic vision equipment. American tanks provided spacious fighting compartments, excellent visibility, and proper crew stations. Every choice reflected different industrial capabilities and strategic priorities. Japan, with limited industrial capacity and resources, built tanks that were simple, light, and cheap to produce. America, with vast industrial capacity, built tanks that were complex, heavy, and expensive, but far more capable. The mathematical result was inevitable. By 1944, American factories were producing tanks at a rate Japanese industry could never match. The Detroit tank arsenal alone, built by Chrysler Corporation, could produce nearly 1,000 tanks per month at peak capacity. That was more than Japan's entire annual tank production. And those American tanks were qualitatively superior in every measurable way. Weight, armor, firepower, mobility, crew protection, fire control, communications, reliability. The Sherman exceeded the Chi-Ha in every category. For the Japanese tankers facing this overwhelming disadvantage, the psychological impact was devastating. They climbed into their Chi-Ha tanks knowing they were obsolete. They advanced toward American positions knowing their armor could not protect them. They fired their 57mm guns, knowing the rounds would bounce harmlessly off Sherman armor. And they died in machines that represented their nation's best effort, but simply were not good enough. The engagements in the Philippines followed a consistent pattern. Japanese tanks would attempt to attack or defend positions. American Shermans would engage from beyond the range where Japanese guns were effective. The Japanese tanks would be destroyed quickly, usually within the first few shots. Survivors would attempt to bail out, often under fire. The pattern repeated across Leyte, then on Luzon, then on every subsequent Pacific battlefield where Japanese armor appeared. On Luzon, in January 1945, the 2nd Tank Division made its final major commitment. They had perhaps 80 tanks remaining, a mixture of Hargo lights and Chi-Ha mediums, plus a small number of newer Type 3 Chi-Nu tanks with improved 75mm guns. The division attempted a coordinated counterattack against American positions. American tanks, tank destroyers, and anti-tank guns destroyed the formation within hours. The 2nd Tank Division ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Its tanks littered the battlefield, burned out hulks that testified to the futility of challenging American armor with obsolete equipment. The Japanese had recognized their tank deficiency earlier than many historians. Acknowledge. As early as 1942, after encounters with Soviet armor and observation of tank warfare in Europe, Japanese engineers began designing improved tanks. The Type 3 Chi-Nu was developed specifically to counter American medium tanks. It mounted a Type 3 75mm gun derived from an anti-aircraft weapon, with muzzle velocity of approximately 700 meters per second. This gun could theoretically penetrate Sherman armor at combat ranges. The Chi-Nu had slightly improved armor protection, with frontal plates reaching 50 millimeters in critical areas. But production was painfully limited. Only 166 Chi-Nu tanks were built during the entire war. Most were retained in Japan for homeland defense, never seeing combat. The few that reached forward areas arrived too late, and in too few numbers to matter. The Type 4 Chi-2, an even more advanced design mounting a long-barreled 75mm gun and weighing over 30 tons, existed primarily as prototypes. Only 2 were completed before the war ended. Japanese industry simply could not produce modern tanks in meaningful quantities. The reasons were multiple and compounding. Raw materials were limited. American submarines had cut the maritime supply lines that brought iron ore, rubber, and other critical materials from Southeast Asia to Japanese factories. Steel production, never adequate for Japan's ambitious military programs, declined steadily after 1942. What steel was available had to be allocated among competing priorities. Naval construction consumed enormous quantities for battleships, carriers, and submarines. Aircraft production demanded aluminum and specialized alloys for airframes and engines. Artillery and small arms manufacturing required steel for barrels, mechanisms, and ammunition. Tanks, considered less critical than ships and aircraft for island defense, received low priority in resource allocation. Manufacturing capacity was similarly constrained. Japan had relatively few factories capable of producing tanks. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries was the primary producer, but their facilities were also manufacturing aircraft engines, trucks, and other military equipment. Expanding production would have required building new factories, training new workers, and diverting resources from other critical programs. The government attempted this in 1943, but results were minimal. Worker productivity was lower than in American or German factories. Japanese workers were dedicated and skilled, but they lacked the automated machinery and assembly line efficiency that characterized Western mass production. What took 10 workers 1 week to build in Japan might take 5 workers 3 days to build in America with better equipment and processes. The result was that Japanese tank production peaked at approximately 1,300 units in 1942 and declined thereafter. By 1944, production had fallen to fewer than 400 tanks of all types. In 1945, production was negligible, perhaps 100 tanks before the war ended. Meanwhile, American production was staggering by comparison. In 1944 alone, American factories produced over 17,000 tanks, including Shermans, light tanks, and tank destroyers. That was more than Japan produced in the entire war from 1937 to 1945. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, purpose-built by the United States government and operated by Chrysler Corporation, was a marvel of mass production. The facility covered over 1.5 million square feet of production space. Assembly lines stretched for miles through the building. Overhead cranes could lift complete hull sections and move them between workstations with precision. The factory operated 3 shifts, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. Workers included experienced automotive workers who brought their manufacturing expertise from civilian car production. But they also included tens of thousands of women, many of whom had never worked in heavy industry before the war. These women, often called Rosie the Riveters, welded armor plate, assembled transmissions, installed engines, and performed virtually every job in the plant except the heaviest lifting tasks. They proved that American industrial capacity could be multiplied exponentially by utilizing the entire workforce. The Detroit Arsenal was not alone. Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, built by General Motors, produced over 11,000 Sherman tanks. American Locomotive Company in Schenectady, New York, produced 2,300 tanks while also maintaining locomotive production. Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio, Pacific Car and Foundry in Washington, Pressed Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania, Pullman Standard in Illinois, and Federal Machine and Welder in Ohio all contributed to Sherman production. 10 major manufacturers plus countless subcontractors producing components created an industrial system without precedent in human history. The scale was almost incomprehensible to Japanese observers. A single American factory could produce more tanks in 1 month than Japan's entire industry produced in 1 year. And those American tanks were superior in every measurable way to their Japanese counterparts. The Sherman weighed 32 tons, fully loaded, compared to the Chiha's 15 tons. It mounted 51 millimeters of well-angled frontal armor compared to 25 millimeters of nearly vertical armor on the Japanese tank. It carried a 75mm gun with twice the muzzle velocity and penetration of the Chiha's 57mm gun. It had a 5-man crew with proper task division compared to the Chiha's cramped 4-man crew. It had radio equipment in every tank enabling coordinated operations compared to Japanese tanks where only 1 in 4 had radios. It had superior vision equipment, better reliability, easier maintenance, and greater operational range. The Sherman was not the best tank of World War II. German Tiger and Panther tanks outgunned and out-armored it significantly. But the Sherman was good enough, and it was available in overwhelming numbers. In the Pacific Theater, where it faced Japanese tanks designed in the 1930s, the Sherman was more than adequate. It was devastatingly superior. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. American tankers who examined captured Chiha tanks after battles in the Philippines came away with professional respect for Japanese engineering skill, combined with recognition of the design's fundamental inadequacy. The Chiha was well built using quality materials and showing careful attention to manufacturing details. Welds were clean and strong. Mechanical components showed precision machining. The engine, though underpowered by American standards, was reliable and well designed for field maintenance. But every aspect of the design reflected constraints that American designers never faced. The armor was thin because Japanese steel production could not support thicker plates without drastically reducing the number of tanks produced. The gun was weak because Japanese industry could not manufacture high-velocity guns in quantity, while also producing naval rifles, artillery, and anti-aircraft weapons. The cramped interior resulted from minimizing size to reduce weight and manufacturing complexity. The lack of advanced features like power traverse, gyro stabilization, and sophisticated fire control reflected limited industrial capacity and technological gaps. American tankers noted that the Chiha's hand-cranked turret traverse required significant physical effort. The gunner had to manually rotate the entire turret using a hand crank, a slow and exhausting process. The Sherman's power traverse, driven by hydraulics, could rotate the turret a full 360 degrees in less than 15 seconds, with minimal effort from the gunner. This seemingly minor difference had profound combat implications. In a meeting engagement where both tanks spotted each other simultaneously, the Sherman could bring its gun to bear much faster than the Chiha. In a fluid combat situation with targets appearing at various angles, the Sherman gunner could track and engage multiple targets, while the Chiha gunner was still hand-cranking his turret to the first target. The Chiha's gun sight was simple, providing minimal magnification and no range-finding capability beyond the gunner's experience and judgment. The Sherman's telescopic sight offered better magnification and clearer optics, making target identification and engagement easier at longer ranges. Combined with the 75mm gun's flatter trajectory and higher velocity, this meant Sherman gunners could achieve first-round hits at ranges where Chi-Ha gunners were still trying to estimate distance and aim point. Vision equipment showed similar disparities. The Chi-Ha commander had limited visibility from the turret. His vision ports were small and positioned to minimize weak points in the armor. To see properly, he often had to open the turret hatch and expose himself to enemy fire. The Sherman commander had a cupola with 6 vision blocks, providing nearly 360-degree observation while remaining protected inside the tank. He could assess the tactical situation, identify threats, and direct his crew without exposing himself. Crew comfort, often dismissed as luxury irrelevant to combat effectiveness, actually mattered significantly. The Chi-Ha's crew fought in a cramped, hot, noisy environment with minimal ventilation. After several hours of combat operations, crew fatigue became severe. Physical exhaustion led to slower reactions, poor decisions, and reduced combat effectiveness. The Sherman's more spacious interior, better ventilation, and ergonomic crew stations allowed crews to fight effectively for longer periods. American tankers could operate for 8 to 10 hours with reasonable effectiveness. Japanese tankers in Chi-Has were exhausted after 4 to 5 hours. In extended battles lasting multiple days, this fatigue factor compounded, giving American crews a growing advantage as engagements continued. The communication systems revealed perhaps the starkest difference in industrial capability and tactical doctrine. Every Sherman had a radio, typically an SCR 528 or SCR 538 set, allowing constant communication between tanks and with infantry and artillery units. A Sherman platoon of 5 tanks operated as a coordinated team, with all tanks able to receive orders and report contact simultaneously. Japanese tank platoons, with only 1 tank in 4 equipped with radio, relied heavily on visual signals. The platoon leader's tank had a radio. The other 3 tanks followed visual cues, flags, or signal lamps. This system worked adequately in training exercises on clear days with good visibility. In combat, with smoke, dust, vegetation, and enemy fire obscuring vision, the system broke down rapidly. Japanese tank platoons often became fragmented collections of individual tanks rather than coordinated teams. The maintenance and reliability comparison was equally revealing. The Sherman was designed for field maintenance by moderately trained crews using standard tools. Major components like the engine, transmission, and final drives could be removed and replaced relatively quickly. The modular design meant a damaged tank could be repaired by swapping out failed components, getting the vehicle back into action within hours, or at most days. The Chi-Ha, while mechanically reliable when new, was difficult to maintain under field conditions. Spare parts were chronically short. Japanese logistics never achieved the efficiency of American supply systems. A Chi-Ha with a damaged transmission might sit immobilized for weeks waiting for parts, if parts ever arrived. American units maintained impressive operational readiness rates, often keeping 80 to 90% of their tanks running. Japanese units struggled to keep 50% operational as the war progressed. Track life demonstrated the industrial quality gap clearly. Sherman tracks, manufactured from high-quality steel using precise casting and heat treatment processes, typically lasted 2,500 to 3,000 miles before requiring replacement. German tracks, manufactured to even higher standards, could last 4,000 miles. Japanese tracks, made from lower-quality steel with less sophisticated manufacturing processes, wore out after 1,000 to 1,500 miles. This difference meant American tanks could conduct longer-range operations without maintenance halts. It meant American logistics systems needed to transport fewer replacement tracks forward, and it meant American tanks spent less time immobilized for track replacement, a vulnerable period when tanks could not fight or move. The cumulative effect of these seemingly minor advantages, track life, radio communication, crew comfort, maintenance ease, and power traverse created overwhelming tactical superiority. An American tank platoon could operate as a coordinated team, maintain high operational readiness, fight effectively for extended periods, and adapt rapidly to changing tactical situations. A Japanese tank platoon struggled with fragmented communications, poor operational readiness, exhausted crews, and slower reaction times. Individual courage and training could not overcome these systemic disadvantages. On Luzon in January and February of 1945, the pattern established at Leyte repeated on a larger scale. Japanese armor attempted to defend key positions and conduct local counterattacks. American forces encountered these efforts and destroyed them systematically. A particularly notable engagement occurred near San Manuel on January 27th. The Japanese 2nd Tank Division committed its remaining operational tanks, perhaps 40 Chiha mediums and various light tanks, in a coordinated attack against American positions. The American 6th Army had multiple tank battalions in the area, equipped entirely with Shermans. The ensuing battle lasted approximately 3 hours. When it ended, 34 Japanese tanks were destroyed or abandoned. 0 American tanks were lost to Japanese tank fire, though several were damaged by anti-tank mines and had to withdraw for repairs. The kill ratio was effectively infinite. You cannot calculate a ratio when the denominator is 0. Japanese tank crews who survived by bailing out before their tanks were destroyed reported their experiences to American interrogators after capture. Their statements revealed the psychological devastation of fighting in obsolete equipment. One tank commander who had served since the China campaigns in 1938 told interrogators that he had believed Japanese spirit and training would overcome material disadvantages. After facing Shermans, after watching his unit's tanks destroyed without achieving a single penetrating hit on American armor, he knew that spirit meant nothing when your equipment simply could not do the job. He described the helplessness of firing the 57mm gun at a Sherman, watching the round strike the frontal armor, and seeing it bounce off without effect. Then the Sherman's turret would traverse slowly, deliberately, taking time to aim properly because the American crew knew they were in no danger. The 75mm gun would fire. The Chiha would be penetrated instantly. Crew members would die or be hideously wounded. The survivors would bail out if they could, abandoning the burning tank that had promised protection but delivered only a steel coffin. Another captured tanker, younger and less experienced, told interrogators he had been shocked by the abundance of American equipment and supplies. His unit had struggled with spare parts, fuel, and ammunition shortages for months. When his tank was disabled and he was captured, he saw American supply dumps that seemed to contain infinite quantities of everything. Fuel drums, ammunition crates, spare tracks, engine parts, food, medical supplies, all stacked in vast piles that dwarfed anything he had seen in Japanese service. He realized then that Japan could not win. The material disparity was too great. One side had everything, the other side had nothing. No amount of courage or fighting spirit could bridge that gap. These accounts, compiled by American military intelligence and analyzed by planners, confirmed what the technical examinations had revealed. Japanese tanks were not merely outmatched, they represented a completely different level of industrial development and military capability. The Chiha was a 1930s tank fighting a 1940s war. It never had a chance. On Okinawa, the last major battle of the Pacific War, the Japanese 27th Tank Regiment defended the island with approximately 27 tanks, a mixture of Type 95 Ha-Go lights and Type 97 Chiha mediums. Japanese commanders, having learned from the disasters in the Philippines, adopted different tactics. Rather than commit armor to mobile operations where American firepower would destroy them quickly, they used tanks as stationary pillboxes. Chiha tanks were positioned in prepared defensive positions, sometimes dug in with only the turret exposed, sometimes placed in caves or bunkers where they could fire from cover. This tactic reduced losses to American tank fire, but eliminated the mobility that was Japanese armor's primary remaining advantage. A tank dug into a fixed position is no longer a tank. It is a poorly designed bunker with thin armor and limited ammunition. American forces on Okinawa had overwhelming armor support. Over 800 tanks supported the 10th Army during the campaign. When American infantry encountered Japanese tanks in defensive positions, they called for Sherman support. The Shermans would engage from standoff ranges, pounding the Japanese positions with 75mm high-explosive rounds until the tanks were destroyed or the crews abandoned them. In some cases, flamethrower tanks moved forward to incinerate the positions with napalm. By the end of the Okinawa campaign in June 1945, all Japanese tanks on the island had been destroyed. Not one American tank was lost to Japanese tank fire during the entire 3-month battle. The Type 97 Chiha's story ended not with a dramatic final battle but with quiet obsolescence and abandonment. Hundreds of Chiha tanks remained in Japan, Manchuria, and scattered garrisons across the Pacific when the war ended in August 1945. They had been held back for the defense of the home islands, a defense that never came. After Japan's surrender, American occupation forces inventoried captured equipment. They found Chiha tanks in various states of readiness across Japan. Some were fully operational, maintained by their crews until the very end. Others were partially disassembled for maintenance, awaiting parts that would never arrive. Many had been cannibalized to keep other tanks running, reflecting the desperate spare parts shortage that plagued Japanese forces. American technical intelligence teams examined these tanks in detail, documenting every aspect of their design and manufacture. The reports confirmed what battlefield experience had already taught. The Chiha was an adequate tank for its intended purpose in the 1930s, hopelessly obsolete by the standards of the System Maurice, 1945. Several Chiha tanks were shipped to the United States for detailed analysis at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland and other testing facilities. American engineers measured armor thickness precisely, tested steel quality metallurgically, and evaluated mechanical systems thoroughly. They found that Japanese manufacturing quality was generally good. The materials were sound. The workmanship was careful. The designs showed intelligent engineering within severe constraints. But constraints had determined every choice. Limited steel meant thin armor. Limited industrial capacity meant simple designs. Limited resources meant minimal protection and basic systems. The engineers concluded that Japanese tank designers had done the best they could with what they had. The problem was not poor design. The problem was inadequate resources and industrial capacity. After the war, some captured Chiha tanks were used for training and display purposes. Several ended up in American and Allied museums as examples of Japanese armor. Others were scrapped as scrap metal was valuable in the post-war period. A few were given to Allied nations as war souvenirs or training aids. Today, surviving Chiha tanks are rare. Perhaps a dozen exist in museums worldwide. They sit as monuments to a failed military strategy and a design philosophy that proved fatally flawed. The lessons of the Chiha's failure extended far beyond tank design. They illustrated fundamental truths about industrial warfare between modern nations. Material capacity matters. A nation's ability to produce weapons in quantity and quality determines military outcomes as much as courage or tactical skill. Resource allocation matters. Japan's decision to prioritize naval and air power over ground forces and armor meant their army fought with inadequate equipment throughout the war. Design philosophy matters. Japanese emphasis on offensive capability at the expense of crew protection meant high crew, casualties, and inability to accumulate experienced personnel. Industrial efficiency matters. American mass production techniques allowed production rates Japan could never match even if resources had been available. Sustainability matters. Equipment designed for short wars fails catastrophically in long wars of attrition. All of these lessons were written in the burning wrecks of Chiha tanks across the Pacific. For the Japanese tankers who climbed into Chiha tanks knowing they were obsolete, knowing their armor could not protect them, knowing their guns could not defeat enemy armor. The experience was one of quiet desperation. They did their duty. They followed orders. They fought with courage against overwhelming odds. But they knew the outcome before they entered battle. When that first 75mm round punched through their frontal armor, it confirmed what they had feared. They were obsolete. Their equipment was obsolete. Their tactics were obsolete. And there was nothing they could do except continue fighting and dying in machines that represented their nation's best effort, but simply were not good enough. For American tankers who fought them, there was no glory in these one-sided engagements. Sherman crews felt relief that Japanese tanks posed minimal threat. They felt professional satisfaction that their training and equipment gave them overwhelming advantages. But they also felt something approaching pity for the men in those Japanese tanks who were sent to fight battles they could not win in equipment that could not protect them. The Type 97 Chiha tank, designed in the mid-1930s to fight in China and Manchuria, met its end facing industrial might it was never designed to counter. 15 tons of steel and courage facing 32 tons of steel and industrial capacity. 25mm of hope facing 51mm of reality. A 57mm gun that represented Japan's best effort facing a 75mm gun that represented American adequacy, not even their best. The mathematics were unforgiving. The outcome was predetermined. The lesson was brutal. In industrial warfare between modern nations, production capacity and material superiority matter more than fighting spirit. The gap between what Japan needed and what Japan could produce was written in the smoking hulls of Chiha tanks from Leyte to Luzon to Okinawa. Each destroyed tank represented not just a tactical defeat, but proof of strategic failure. Japan had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with equipment from an earlier era and a design philosophy optimized for a different kind of war. The cost was measured in lives lost, battles forfeited, and ultimately in total defeat. The Chiha tank had been designed to support Japanese expansion in Asia against poorly equipped opponents. It had succeeded brilliantly in that role from 1937 to 1941, but when it faced the United States military with their Sherman tanks, their overwhelming material advantages, and their sophisticated combined arms doctrine, the Chiha's inadequacy was exposed with shocking clarity. The same clarity that came to those Japanese tank crews on Leyte when they fired their 57mm guns and watched the rounds bounce harmlessly off Sherman armor, then saw the Sherman's turret traverse with mechanical precision, knowing what was coming next, unable to do anything except wait for the 75mm round that would end their lives. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.